Hello, everyone. Welcome. And welcome back to those of you who last year participated in this Sunday afternoon class on the Protestant Reformation. We're here this year for a follow-up called the post-Reformation. And I'm sorry I'm a little late getting down here. I actually wanted to do a proper introduction for Becky Serling, and it took forever for that stuff to print out. If you go on Google all her publications and presentations and all the stuff that she's done, apparently she can't hold a job because it keeps, But it's so wonderful to have you back here on a Sunday afternoon. As you probably heard coming up the street, there's a band warming up out in the parking lot to the south of us. The Virginia Road Band, our contemporary worship band, is going to be playing this afternoon out in the parking lot, and the In-N-Out truck is there. They're already beginning to make hamburgers. And I've been told that though we had, I think, 340 people sign up for burgers at the In-N-Out truck, so we're expecting a large group. We ordered additional burgers just to be on the safe side for anybody who wanted to come, and I've been assured there are going to be plenty. So if you would like to join us and you haven't signed up, that's okay. We have burgers, and we'd love to have you join us following our class this morning. I'm in that mode apparently. Following our class this afternoon, which will be an abbreviated class because of all of that that's going on. So this is an abbreviated launch of our post-Reformation class, and we'll be looking at what happened after the Reformation and what difference it makes. So to lead us in this, I'm so pleased that Dr. Becky Serling has agreed once again to return and to provide direction for us as we take up this topic. Becky Serling has a new job, actually. I think that came not long ago. She is the director of a program at USC with the Catholics. What's the exact title?
The Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies.
Institute for Advanced Catholic
Studies, not Advanced Catholic
Studies. Yeah. Advanced Studies, not Advanced Catholics. But she is a graduate of USC, where she did her PhD in medieval European history. And her dissertation was entitled Taking Their Place, Benedictine Child Oblates at 11th Century Canterbury Cathedral Priory. So her concentration has been the history of Christianity. She has taught at a number of places, is an affiliate faculty member, has been at Fuller Seminary, where she's taught. She did her Master of Divinity work at Fuller Seminary, and she has been a Christian educator in a variety of contexts, including the Malibu Presbyterian Church. There was another Presbyterian church, and I can't think of the name of it right now.
I'm going to talk about it.
Okay, well, you're gonna introduce that. But several years ago, I tried desperately to get Becky Serling to come on the staff here at the church. and we had a wonderful conversation. She was in her PhD program at USC at that time, and she just decided she really had to focus on her studies and her young family. So it's always a pleasure to welcome her back to San Marino Community Church. And so please join me in greeting her and giving her a warm San Marino welcome. Becky Serling.
Just so you know that I'm really a Presbyterian, I know that the Book of Order says that, the Book of Order says that we only applaud because we're giving God the glory, not each of us, because it's from God that we get our gifts and talents. So, yay God. So, falling apart or coming together, and I should say, we will come together. We won't completely fall apart. And I am absolutely delighted to be back. It was a lot of fun last year. Our family came to, I think, all of the sessions. So it was great fun, and it was wonderful to hear that you all wanted to continue learning what happened after the Reformation. So let me just explain the choice of the title, Falling Apart or Coming Together. Right in the middle of the Reformation, after the Reformation, in the 15th century, in the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and in the 21st century, people have said, well, why don't we get back together? Why don't we get back together? That has been a continuous theme throughout the history of the church on both sides of the Protestant Catholic divide. But unfortunately, we have not been able to come back together. And the Reformation was a huge divide. We're not going to be distracted. I'm sure he's just getting the whatever thing it is for the really big hamburgers next door. And I don't want to embarrass SMCC engineer. But we might as well just be distracted and let it get over with. Thank you so much. Have a good time. Okay, so the Reformation was a way bigger divide than that was, interruption. So what is interesting to me, and I should say before I say what's interesting to me, our kids were in a Catholic school for most of their elementary school years. Ellie started when she was in 3rd grade. And because we aren't Catholics, and Ellie was only 8, when they went to Mass and it was time for communion, Ellie went right up and took it. And she did this all year long. Until her teacher, Miss Smith, who everyone adored, said, apparently in the middle of Mass, to the priest, "Don't do that." And so Ellie got a blessing that day instead of communion. And then the class, because it was a teeny weeny little class, of course everybody was curious, these 8-year-olds. Well, how come? And Miss Smith, I thought, had the best explanation. She said, well, you know what? We are all friends now. You know, we love Ellie, and we have lots and lots of friends who are Protestants. But the thing is, it's like our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents got a divorce. And we don't exactly know how to get back together, because there's all those greats in between us. And we've tried really hard at times, but we're still separate. And this is a symbol of that separation. And so it's one of the reasons that I'm really interested in looking at this period immediately following the Reformation, to see how people who didn't have all those greats in between them, how they dealt with some of the things that happened, that went on in a really practical sort of way. And I want to say something now so that I don't forget, and I'm just kind of trying to figure out how to have the microphone and see my notes. We have some, well, as you might imagine, since I work for a place of advanced Catholic studies, we have many, many good friends who are Roman Catholic. And one of our priest friends said to us, when we're concerned about the unity of the church, he said, you know, that time of communion, when I'm at your church and I'm not taking communion, and you're at our church and you're not taking communion, that's the best time to pray for the unity of the church, because it's the most visible time of disunity. And so I would just invite you from now on, but particularly this fall as we're thinking about these things, to pray for the unity of the church and use our time when we're in communion, when it's supposed to be communion, and we know that it's not, but to use that time to pray for the unity of the church. So it was a huge divide. You can see it there. And I want to talk today about the what of that divide, what happened, what was going on, but also the so what. The so what, why should we care? So let me talk a little bit about the so what first. And this is really, I talk to my students at Fuller Seminary who really want to take ministry classes, and I love ministry classes too, but sometimes I have to convince them that it's a good thing to do church history. So what I tell them about doing church history is we need to go a little bit beyond that old saw, well, you have to know history so you don't repeat it. Well, okay, sure. But you have to know history first. And I think this has come home really in stark reality even just yesterday. Our daughter, who I think will be here next week, is in Germany right now. And yesterday she visited Dachau, the concentration camp just outside of Munich. And so she was very aware of learning history so as not to repeat it. So there'll be some of that. But more than that, I think we ask questions of the past based on the present. So we're asking different questions than my parents did, than their parents did, because we live at a different time. Our questions are based on what we're living through now. So just think for a minute about our present. We live in a time of crazy division. Do we not? This is all we talk about, how divided we are. Well, as a historian, when I think back, I think, golly, the Reformation was a time of crazy, horrible division as well. So that would be a good time period to ask the questions I'm asking today of that time period as well. And it's a time when articles like the one I just looked at this week, entitled Ecumenical Winter, are being published. And contrary to what I was just talking about, the concern to come back together, this author, who happens to be a Catholic, but who's been involved in ecumenical discussions for decades, with the Roman Catholic Church and every brand of Protestantism that you can imagine, he's very fearful that those discussions will close down. So I look and I worry when I look out at our present and I think, wow, we're divided and we might be getting even more divided. And that's not what I want to see. So it informs the questions that I ask. And we come up with not what is a different version of the past, not a truer version of the past, not one that's closer to the reality of what really happened, because we can never find that out. We just can't. It's gone, it's done, we don't know. There's too many people and events missing from the historical record. So we're not after a truer, more real version of the past, but we're after some answers, some hints to the kinds of questions that we have now, based on present. And the story that we tell about the past also depends on who the storyteller is, on the perspective the storyteller is coming from, the point of view, the question that the storyteller asks. Well, I'm your storyteller. So, you've heard a little bit about the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about, that I think, based on what we're living through now, the kinds of questions we can ask about the Reformation, and particularly the time after the Reformation, when everything was up in the air. I am an ordinary person. I'm not a politician. I'm not officially a pastor. I'm a mom. I want to know what moms did in that time of division after the Reformation. What did they tell their kids about how to pray? They had been praying certain prayers and repeating certain creeds. What did they say? What did they tell their kids? Did they pray for grandma in purgatory, or did they just stop? These are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. And I think that it's interesting to look back at the Reformation, because the voices that we hear, in spite of how hard we really tried last year to hear the lower voices, the higher voices, the quieter voices, especially the voices of women, the Reformation was a time when men were really talking really loud. We kind of have a time like that right now. There's some people that are talking really, really loud. How did they manage? People didn't move in lockstep just because the big voice that we can hear are the really loud ones telling them, stop praying for souls in purgatory. We're here, I think, on a beautiful Sunday afternoon because we care about our faith. And we know that we weren't just plopped here. We came from some people who came from some people who came from some other people who had similar kinds of questions. So, we want to find out what happened next. Did things continue to fall apart? Or was there an impetus to compromise, to come back together? And the answer is yes. And so we'll look a little bit about what that involves. So I want to go back to the what. So we talked a little bit about why are we doing this, the so what. I want to go back to what actually happened. So I want you to put your imagination caps on and imagine that the world before the Reformation could be represented by this lovely bowl of fruit. Sure, there were some rotten apples, some worms in there. They were pointed out by several people, but why not just take out the bad apples and leave the fruit bowl beautifully done in that way? But that wasn't what happened. Somehow, religion moved from being that lovely, sort of calm bowl of fruit that you just get down from your cupboard and completely morphed into a new baby carriage made out of watermelon. Now, all of the fruit is still in there. There's still pineapple, there's still strawberries, there's still watermelon, there's still grapes. But it looks like a completely different thing. What I want to look at today, especially, we're going to move to the baby buggy in the next few weeks. But I want to look at today that middle what. What was it that happened? In that middle were questions about church and state, what we would call church and state. There were questions of elites and non-elites. So, like it or not, we would have been elites. We could read. We had means of transportation. We were somewhat mobile. So there were questions of elites and non-elites. There were questions of clergy and laity. All of us except one are, well, no, wait. We've got, who's clergy in here? Raise your hands. Well, we got two. It's about the same percentage. A few clergy and a lot of laity. And most importantly, running through all those places are questions of heresy and orthodoxy and who got to define it. So we're going to take a look at some of these and the ways they got configured and reconfigured. Now, some people really literally tried to stay in the middle. They dealt with this split. They refused to go to the Protestant side, and they refused to stay in the Catholic side. So let me tell you about one, probably that you're familiar with, if you, at least from some sort of Western Civ class. His name is Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was about contemporary with Martin Luther, 1466 to 1536, which makes him really contemporary with Katie Luther as well. So he was a leading humanist. That meant he had gone back to the Latin and Greek to study. He wasn't just taking for granted what all the intervening scholars had told him, particularly Thomas Aquinas. People were going back to the Latin and Greek and reading for themselves. He even wrote a satire called In Praise of Folly, which again, some of you may have had to read at some point in some Western Civ or English Lit class. It's a satire of superstitious beliefs in pre-Reformation Europe. It's funny to read if you know what you're reading. But in spite of all that, and in spite of his sympathetic kind of view of Luther in particular, he remained a Roman Catholic his entire life. He never moved. He was definitely in the middle. He's very critical of the Roman Catholic Church, but he never moved over to the Protestant world. He never converted, as we would say. There was a lot of people like that. Some of their names we know, a whole bunch of them, we have no clue what their names were. But we know they kind of heard what was going around, they heard the rumbling, and they thought, well, yeah, maybe, but that doesn't mean we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? No. So they stayed in the Catholic Church while criticizing it. For example, he continued, just so we're clear about what's going on in the middle there. He recognized the authority of the Pope. He refused to, diss the Pope. He had very great respect for the traditional practices of faith and piety, in spite of his criticism of sometimes the way that they were used by people or by priests who didn't know what they were talking about. Again, some of those wormy apples he wanted to get rid of, but he wanted to stay with that beautiful bowl of fruit. So Erasmus was a public figure. But what about ordinary people? Now, on the continent, religion went with... Long, it's not moving. There we go. On the continent, religion went with land and ruler. So there's a very famous saying that came out of the treaty, the Peace of Augsburg, which happened in 1555, but you don't have to remember the date. The Treaty of Augsburg said, cuius regio eius religio. And that just means his reign, his religion. So, remember Prince Frederick, the one who protected Martin Luther? And we talked about how Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, which was not, but which was divided into a bunch of pieces that were ruled over by princes. Well, some of those princes converted to Catholicism, and some of them, converted to Protestantism, some of them stayed Catholic. So finally, after 20, 30 years of okay, what are we going to do? Pope Leo is still messing around. There's nothing is settled. Finally, they came to a resting point, and we'll see next week that this was only a resting point. This fell apart almost as soon as the ink had dried. But they decided, okay, if the prince is Protestant, then his land, his rule, his reign, his area, his fiefdom, whatever you want to call it, that was Protestant. If he was Catholic, it was Catholic. And the great thing is, people, really, we're not kidding you, if your prince is Protestant right now, but you always kind of thought, I'm not so sure about this, I'd really rather be Catholic, you can move. It's really okay. You can move to another area that has a Catholic prince. Now, that was the technical thing. They said you can sell, you won't suffer any, the real estate market for Protestant Catholics moving out of Protestant area into a Catholic area, the real estate market will not be affected. You'll be able to sell your land and your stuff at market value. And we're not going to make fun of you. So your property and your honor will be intact. Now, did that really happen? Yeah, everyone's going, yeah, right, no. Well, probably not. No, although people did move. My guess is they did not get full price for their land, and people probably at a bare minimum pointed fingers at them and said, yeah, well, you don't belong here anyway. But that was the deal. And we'll find out much more about this next week when we talk about the 30 Years' War, which was really the dreadful, dreadful aftermath of the Reformation. So that was for what technically we call in history middling folks. So they're not princes, they don't really have a whole lot of public power, but they've got a little land. We call them middling folks. Ordinary people also had response to this middle time of the Reformation. And I wonder if any of you have heard of this book. I'm sorry, I could not find it at home. It's called The Cheese and the Worms. Has anybody read this? Oh my gosh, this is just an amazing book. It's about this man whose name was Minocchio. And he lived he was middle of the 16th century, end of the 16th century. This is exactly when all of this, that middle time period, this is when Minocchio lives. He was in Italy, and I forget, he was something like a shoemaker. He was he had a profession. But you know all that literacy that everybody always talks about with the Reformation? Well, it really did. It wasn't just Germany. It really happened all over the place. And Minocchio was this, we'll just say he's a shoemaker, in Italy. And he started reading. He read the Bible, he read some other stuff, some commentaries on the Bible. And, Minocchio thought for himself. And this is what he said. This is where the title comes from, The Cheese and the Worms. This is what he says. He got called because he was in Italy. He got hauled up in front of the Inquisition because the Inquisition were worried about people in this middle time period. And don't confuse the Inquisition at this time and place in Italy with the Spanish Inquisition. Oops, that's a little later. So we've got Minocchio. The Dominicans haul him up before the Inquisition and they say, "What the heck are you talking about?" And this is what Minocchio says. "Well, I have said that, in my opinion, all was chaos. That is, earth, air, water, and fire were mixed together. And out of that bulk, a mass formed, just as cheese is made out of milk. And worms appeared in it. And those were the angels. The most holy majesty decreed that these should be God and the angels, and among that number of angels there was also God. He too, having been created out of that mass at the same time, and he was named Lord with 4 captains, Lucifer, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. That Lucifer sought to make himself Lord equal to the king, who was the majesty of God, and for this arrogance God ordered him driven out of heaven with all his host in his company. And this God later created Adam and Eve and people in great number to take the places of the angels who had been expelled. And as this multitude did not follow God's commandments, he sent his son, whom the Jews seized, and he was crucified." Now, you can hear a little thread of, okay, yeah, I can see that in Scripture. But he's got cheese and the angels are worms in the cheese that had been made out, and they're kind of peeking out of the cheese. Just imagine Swiss cheese with angels peeking out of those holes. So this is a person, Minocchio, who lived in this middle time, and this is how he dealt with things. He's like, I need to see what I think for myself. I know this is what the priest says, and I know this is what I'm supposed to think, but I've done some reading, and this is what I think. Well, at first, the Dominicans just kind of chuckled, as we are inclined to chuckle. In the end, it didn't end up so well for Minocchio, and he was burned at the stake. Yes, I'm sorry. But a fascinating glimpse into an ordinary person and how he managed this time of flux when loud men are yelling at him. I'm going to think for myself and read for myself. Certainly a response that any of us might have. Thankfully, at this point, we are not risking being burned at the stake as a result. But to see really what I think is the best picture of ordinary people coping with the bigger changes brought by the Reformation, I think it's helpful to go to England. And I think it'll be great for us because we stopped with Scotland, right? And a bunch of you went to Scotland, and we know about all those Johns in Scotland, John Knox and the monstrous regiment of women, and all of that, how that worked out. And if you don't, I'll give you my notes from that lecture last year. But let's go south and look at the English Reformation, which we didn't talk a whole lot about last year. So remember, if you will, Henry VIII. Try not to get it mixed up with that Tudor series, which I have not seen. Henry VIII, although he ended up King of England, was not actually the eldest son of Henry II. He was number 2. Arthur was supposed to be King Arthur. Heaven knows what would have happened if it had been King Arthur, but it wasn't. It was Henry VIII. Arthur was betrothed and married to Catherine of Aragon, whose name probably sounds familiar, and it should. But 6 months after they got married, Arthur died. So Henry VII, who's still king, thought, okay, I gotta pull something out here, because Catherine of Aragon was chosen because she's from Spain. We need to have Spain as an ally. Now, we're going to hear a lot more about Spain in the next couple of weeks, but for now, just put a pin in it. Catherine of Aragon was the youngest surviving child of Ferdinand and Isabella. Remember them? Columbus? Yes, same folks. So not only did Ferdinand and Isabella send Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, they had a daughter named Catherine of Aragon, because that's where she lived, and they sent her to England, jolly old England, to marry the king. Well, the prince. And she ended up marrying 2. As you may remember, it didn't go so well. Henry VIII, unlike what we usually think of Henry as being sort of all bluster, he was actually trained in the church. He was the second son, so he was supposed to go on. He wasn't going to be the king, he was going to be the priest. So he had some background in religion, even by the time he was 10 when his brother died. So he took his responsibility as king to have an heir very seriously, and because that was part of his obligation as a Christian king. Not just as a king, but as a Christian king. And so it didn't happen. And then the story that we're familiar with begins. He wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope didn't want him to, and so on and so on. So finally, Henry splits from Rome and turns England into a Protestant nation. His son, Edward VI, when Henry dies, becomes the first Protestant king, the first king that's ever been completely Protestant in England. Then he's succeeded by Mary, his half-sister, who took England back to the Catholic side. Then Queen Elizabeth comes and takes them back to the Protestant side. So that middle section of the Reformation, of that break, the break lasted quite a while because there was so much toing and froing. So you've got Henry, who really wants to be in power. He's trying to be a good Christian king. He breaks with the Pope. Okay, so done with them. We're Protestants now over here. But not as Protestant as Luther, because that was kind of problematic in other ways. And so he's kind of like quasi-Protestant. He's English. Then he has his son Edward, who jumps over and he's like all the way Protestant. Yay. Then Mary, Bloody Mary as we call her, she's like, forget this. I'm a Catholic. Always been a Catholic. And all the English go this way. And then Elizabeth comes and nope, she's back here. So you can see in England, in the space of 3 lifetimes, Mary's and Edward's were short lifetimes, they went back and forth and back and forth. And it's actually fairly easy to tell what was going on with ordinary people at this unpredictable time in England. And to fortunate. Here comes the other church that I worked for, Brentwood Presbyterian. Those of you who were at the Scotland lecture remember that Brentwood Presbyterian Church has this amazing time machine. And every once in a while, they send people through. And last year we heard from, we heard from John Knox, didn't we? Last year, yeah. Well, they let us borrow it again. And today we had with us a man, I think his name is Hugh Latimer, who lived in England through these three reigns, Henry VIII, Edward, and Mary. Is that right? Hugh, are you here?
Well, hello. It's a fine September day you have here. I had not heard of California, but it seems quite a fine place. A lot more sunshine than where I come from. Let's see. What are these things for?
Magnify your voice.
But forgive me, I am remiss. I should say who I am. My name is Hugh Latimer. I was born we just built big cathedrals and you could hear people's voices. My name is Hugh Latimer. I was born about 1487, just about 20 years before your John Calvin. We never met, as Calvin lived, of course, on the continent, and I lived in England. England, during the time of Henry and Edward and Mary, the Tudors. I understand you have some sort of play acting that tells about the family. I heard that was, well, titillating. I suppose the Tudors were that, but for those of us alive during their reign, well, they were the force to be reckoned with. But I'm ahead of the story Becky asked me to tell. As I said, I'm Hugh Latimer. I started learning Latin grammar when I was 4. Not so bad, really. I took a liking to it, and eventually I went to Cambridge University. After I graduated, I was elected a fellow of Clare College. As a fellow, that's a person who gets paid to study. And study I did. I received the Master of Arts in 1514, and then the next year I was ordained a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. Several years later, I became the university preacher and chaplain at Cambridge. It was wonderful both to do ministry, as I think you say, and to be able to continue to study in the university. And continue to study I did. I received my Bachelor of Divinity, more like the doctoral degree now, I understand. In my disputation, that's something like a dissertation, I refuted soundly and thoroughly, I thought, the new Protestant ideas coming across the channel from the continent. Mind you, this is what Henry VIII had done just 3 years earlier. And Pope Leo gave him the title Defender of the Faith. Pope Leo, you do remember him. He's the one that got into the tangle with Martin Luther. Those Protestant Reformed ideas were nothing less than heresy. And I firmly put them in their place during my public presentation. Or so I thought. Then a young fellow priest named Thomas Bilney came to see me. He wanted to make his confession. Well, of course, I was a priest, so I looked forward to hearing his confession, giving him penance and absolving him. We might then work together, I thought, in the continuing work of putting these ideas down. Thomas Bilney. Tom had a different kind of confession in mind. Not a confession of sin, but a confession of belief. When he came to me, he told me that he had heard my disputation, and he told me he completely accepted the new Protestant thought. What? Why on earth? Well, he told me, he thought that the kind of scholastic theological studies being done were, in a word, well, boring. Boring? Yes, he told me that he had gotten fed up with them and started reading the new Greek translation of the Testament, of the New Testament, that Erasmus had done. Erasmus. He was one of the people I was dead set against in my disputation. Well, Tom went on to say that when he was reading 1 Timothy, he was struck by the words of 1 Timothy 1:15, which say, "This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the chief." Tom told me that immediately he felt a marvelous comfort and quietness, so much so that he almost leapt for joy. After that, he told me, Scripture began to be pleasant, not boring at all. And he learned that all the work we were doing, fasting and processing and keeping track of our church going, all that work missed the point. If we were doing all that work without Jesus, why, it was a waste of time, because only Christ saves people from their sins. I learned more from Tom's confession than I had learned in 20 years. And I immediately accepted the Protestant teachings that I had just so carefully rejected. Well, things went on apace. I had learned how important Scripture was, and so I began advocating for its translation into English. That was problematic because Tyndale's translation had just been banned. And I got hauled before old Cardinal Wolsey a couple of years later. That was under King Henry VIII. Wolsey was still a Roman Catholic, and that time he left me off with an admonition. But he went out of favor with Henry when he condemned Henry's first divorce. Then I was in favor with Henry VIII and with his son Edward, the first king of England, who was Protestant from the day he was crowned. Alas, Edward died and was succeeded by his half-sister, Queen Mary. She was a Roman Catholic from the day she was crowned, and that was my undoing. 1555, under Queen Mary, I was burned at the stake. Following the example of martyrs on both sides of the divide, Protestants like Anne Askew and Catholics like the Franciscan friar John Forrest, I preached the sermon before Friar John's fire. Things in England were, well, strange in terms of religion. Strange as in unpredictable. So many people committed to the church, committed to Jesus, and having to negotiate how to be committed in light of who was in power. Protestantism or Catholicism, one or the other was ascendant for decades. It made it difficult for those of us who were in the public eye, but it was also difficult for ordinary people who cared about their lives and their families and their faith. Becky will tell you about some of the ways they lived during this unpredictable time. Thank you.
Poor Hugh, I was supposed to put his picture up. There he is. That's Hugh Latimer. And I want to tell you about another book. And this one is a big book. You all were talking about that little Protestant book, the book about the Protestant Reformation that we read last year. This actually is a wonderful book. It looks intimidating, but it's not. And I would really encourage you to read it if you're interested in the next little bit that I talk about. It's by Eamon Duffy, who's an Englishman, and it's called The Stripping of the Altars. And what he did really was this was, I think, came out in the 90s, but when he started out, he thought, we've got one story that we tell about the English Reformation, and that is Henry VIII came in, okay, maybe he wasn't so great, but the priests were fat and lazy, and all they did was, take people's money from them in taxes and rip off the poor, and nobody cared anything about the faith. It was all dead until the Protestant Reformation came in, and now we're Anglican and everything's better. And he said, that can't be. That's too much. So he went back and he looked at some different kinds of sources, and I'll show you some of them. Again, and I think this is so fascinating because it depends on the way we tell history, depends on who's asking the questions and who's telling the story. So let me tell you, he looked at some books of hours. I don't know if you remember last year we talked about books of hours, I think, a little bit, and how small they were. Maybe just about this size, enough to fit in your hand. And they circulated widely in England at this time. Something like, actually, this devotional book. This is the little devotional book that I use. They weren't obviously disposable. This one's for September, so I'll throw it away when October comes. They didn't throw them away, and in fact, they used them so much that I want to show you some pictures. This one has some prayers. Now, actually, no, this one's birthdays. That long list on the left-hand side of the page is this family's birthdays. So they had their prayer book, which sometimes were called primers, but they had their prayer book that told them when the saints' days were. There was a calendar, a church calendar in there. There were readings, there were prayers, and there was also some spaces. And so when they had space, they would copy things that were important to your families. I don't know if any of you have big family Bibles that were sold at the turn of the 20th century. I have one, and the middle is full of my family's birthdays and death days. And this was an important family record, but the thing was, at this time, not only were people getting these and just holding them or something as some sort of superstitious object that would help, they were reading them, and they were writing in them. Before and during the Reformation. Now, here's a very interesting one. This prayer, it's in Latin, but it's a prayer of indulgence. It's a prayer for the dead. Now, these are, all of our, red flags should be going up. Prayer for the dead, indulgences, this is what we're against. No. Well, this is from a prayer book that was used during this middle time period, this back and forth thing. And what is so neatly crossed out down at the bottom, do you see where there's an erasure, a big black cross being crossed out? That's the Pope's name. So, yep, we are Protestant, and because of that, we're crossing out the Pope's name. No popes. But we're still going to pray for our dear people who have died and gone before us. So, this was how some people negotiated the Reformation before Elizabeth. Let me show you a couple more slides. Mary then came, so we're still in the middle period, but we've got this period of about 8 years, I think, when Mary is queen and everything reverts back to Catholicism. And actually, that was when Latimer was burned at the stake. Then if you go to Oxford, he's, I think, one of 3 Oxford martyrs that are commemorated with, monument in Oxford. Did you see that when you were just there? Did you see the martyrs? Yes, okay. What good is it to send your husband and daughter to Oxford and they don't see the Martyrs Memorial? Anyway, there's a Martyrs Memorial. But interestingly now, there's also places that are indicated where Catholics were also martyred as well. People on both sides who were so firm in their faith that they were willing to die for it. So under Mary, it was the Protestants. Interestingly enough, we now know through completely different kind of evidence, physical evidence, that people must have during the first years of the Reformation, from, say, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries when things really got going against the Catholics, and then during Edward's reign. Well, parts of churches needed to be taken down or defaced. So we're all familiar probably with statues and stuff, objects that were defaced during the French Revolution. There's a lot, this is always a big famous thing. People came on and noses were knocked off of people in the church as far up as people could reach. Well, a similar kind of thing happened in England. In England, a lot of churches had these wooden rood screens, and they were screens that separated the main part of the congregation from the altar. You couldn't go back there. Only the clergy could go behind that rood screen. Well, there's no need for a rood screen if you're Protestant, so they took them down. But there's evidence now that they took them down and they hid them. They didn't destroy them, they kept them. So when Mary came to power, when she was crowned, they put them back up. And so what the image on the left shows, and you can come and look at it later, and there's actually, but all of these images are from this book, Stripping the Altars. You can tell where it's joined right back where it used to be. You can see the little line, and I don't know what they used for wood glue, but it looks like wood glue, that they glued that thing back in there and put the rood screen back up. So again, during this middle time, when they're not sure what's going to happen, they put their things away. Just like I was talking to Joan, I didn't start with this, but sometimes practices got put away as well. So it's like you move house and you put the boxes all in the garage and then you unpack some of them. Not everything got unpacked. Some of the rood screens got unpacked. Some of the practices, like prayers for the dead, continued. Other practices, like spiritual direction, didn't so much. And as time has gone on, as people have asked questions and heard things like, well, spiritual direction, that sounds like not a bad thing. How come we didn't do that? And those practices then, along with physical objects like rood screens, get put back into place. So one more that I'll show you. I've circled the important part here. This is again in a prayer book, a little book of hours. And when things were going the Protestant direction, this was a calendar. So when it was Thomas à Becket's Saint's Day, they quite obediently crossed him out, because we're not going to celebrate saints anymore, even really famous saints like Thomas à Becket and the Canterbury Trail and all that. So they took him out. Then Mary came back into power, and they penciled him right back in. So these are the ways that people dealt with this middle time that was neither really here nor there. It was like fruit basket upset. They had tossed that beautiful bowl of fruit up in the air, but it hadn't come back down into a new bowl yet. And so everything was upset, and people dealt with it in different ways. Erasmus stayed in the Catholic Church. Minocchio thought about cheese and worms. People in England kept their books, changed them the way they were supposed to, and then changed them back, along with the way that they changed their churches. So, back to so what? Why do we care about these people? Obviously, they're interesting. I would love to meet some of these people who stowed that rood screen in their barn underneath the straw or whatever. They had to have been amazing people and very faithful Christians, I think. But one reason to think about it, besides just it being interesting, is that it really decenters ourselves. To me, living in this time that can be honestly kind of frightening. I've stopped listening to the news. So it's like so whacked out. When I think about times in the past that surely were even more whacked out, that's a really technical historical term, totally whacked out, and I see people who were faithful Christians on two sides that were so clear-cut then, and yet now are not as clear-cut. I think, okay, God is in his heaven, and God is in charge. We're Presbyterians. We believe in the sovereignty of God. And that's the other reason that I think is the so what of doing history. It gets me out of the middle and out of my own preoccupations with what's going on around me. But the other thing is it not just gets me out of the middle, it puts my gaze, it puts our gaze directly onto God and wondering and marveling at the way God works in different peoples, in different times, in different places. We often talk about this kind of wonder when we're thinking about nature. Stars are beautiful and we can see God's majesty, or we see a tiny baby and we see those dark little lashes against the curve of that face. And we think, oh, God is good, God is wonderful. We can also experience the marvel and the wonder of God's presence in the past. When we look at the people who were our brothers and sisters who lived through some of these really unsettling and dangerous times in the past. And we will continue that next week when we talk about the 30 Years' War, when things were not so much up in the air anymore, they had settled, but not settled in a way that people were happy about. So they came at each other. We are just 5 minutes over, so if people want to go get hamburgers right now, I know they're over there because I smelled them when we came. But also, if there are any questions, I would be happy to take questions, and I won't be offended or anything if you get up and leave. Yeah.
Yeah. How do we make peace with family if they're seen as the Antichrist?
How do we make peace with family if they're seen with the Antichrist, as the Antichrist?
They are the Antichrist.
The family.
The family.
It's very difficult to make peace with family when they think you're the Antichrist, and vice versa. I think that in the same way, and this is not a historical question, that I think this is a question for all time. I think we do what our priest friend told us to do, and that is hold them in prayer. Because, you know what, there are some people, I'm sure we all have some in our lives, that we just can't, no matter how hard we try, cannot reconcile with, and it's very grievous. But that doesn't exempt us from holding them in our prayers. And I think that is another way of decentering us and them and putting it all into God's hands. And I don't mean that to be a simplistic answer. I really don't, because I honestly think that's one of the hardest things that we're called to do. Yeah, Lee?
You might next week bring some, we've got some nice prayers for enemies that actually came out of this.
I do. Good, help me remember that. I'll bring some prayers for enemies next week. It's another way historians do our business, is to look at prayers and sermons, and they're interesting. Good questions. Yeah, Lynn?
Do you have a prayer book that you use every day? Is that the one that you use?
I do. And that's not history either. This is, there's Our Daily Bread, I don't know what the Presbyterian Church, I happen to use, this one is put out by the Benedictines in Collegeville, Minnesota. It's called Give Us This Day. And it's daily prayer, so it's morning, midday, and evening prayers. And let's just be perfectly honest, I don't get to the evening ones.
How did you choose that, Becky? Why that? We have a prayer book, an old prayer book that's not in print anymore, but we love it. And that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, this one, it's because I know the people who put it out. So some of you know that our family, Lee and I and Ella, are Benedictine Oblates, which is a whole other story, but it means we are Protestants who live as much as we can according to the rule of St. Benedict. It's a long story, so you'll just have to trust me. Ask me later. And the Benedictines have an abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, which is about an hour and a half west of the Twin Cities. And they have a printing press, and they print, one of the things that they print is this little devotional. And we like it. It's fun because they don't do saints, technically, they do blessed among us. And every once in a while, and a lot of them are Catholics, but they also, it's wonderful because they pick Protestants too, and every once in a while they oh, I know who that is. So, anyway, yeah, that's how we choose. Anything else? Oh,
I
yeah.
just have a question. If you miss a class, is there a way to get the lecture or?
Are they
online or?
Are these being recorded? Sorry.
Yes, we have a video recording, and it will be available. I think we uploaded it on YouTube, so yes,
So,
we'll have it available.
so let's hope I don't make any really awful mistakes. Okay. All right, we're good. And I'll be back. Please come again next week. I can't promise it's a really uplifting topic, but we'll be talking about war, the 30 Years' War. Thank you.